Hello and welcome back to the second of the study units on strategy and innovation. Remember, in this study unit we're looking at why changes, innovation or other changes can cause even large firms to fail. And we talked about how a firm and an industry can develop a dominant design that makes it hard for firms in that industry to change when a new innovation comes along. Effectively, the firms are locked in to the behaviours, resources, approaches, and through the expectation of external stakeholders in the types of strategic choices that they can make. We also talked about how in the literature there are two views on whether organisations can escape from that trap. The first line of literature, which we covered in the last study unit, suggests that if you go at it the right way, we can break free of the dominant design. In this study unit, we're looking at the views that those barriers to change are just too high to overcome. Now, in this stream of literature, there are two theories worth looking at to explain why even good firms go bad. The first of this is all about the cognitive limits that managers and the firm might have, which means the firm experiences difficulty in recognising the change that is occurring and how it needs to realign its activities and change its competencies. The second theory, called disruptive innovation, views the firm as making rational choices in responses to the demands in its marketplace. Effectively, it fails because it does the right thing. Now, in this video, we're going to start by looking at the first of these, that for some types of change, firms find it difficult to recognise the nature of that change and then change accordingly. Now, remember, in the last video we talked about how products and services and their production was a system comprising of two elements. The first, the individual components that make up that offering and its delivery to market, and secondly, the architecture, how those components are integrated together into a whole. Now, Henderson and Clark use those two elements to categorize types of innovation. So in terms of components, component change could be minimal or at least minor and incremental, or change could be radical. You radically change the components that make up that system. On the other dimension, we look at change in the architecture. And here again, change can be minor or at least incremental, or it can be a step change, i.e. radical. Those two dimensions define a 2x2. Where would strategy be without 2x2s? But a 2x2 describing four different types of innovation, where the change in components and the change in architecture are minimal or at least incremental. Henderson and Clark call that incremental innovation. Now, this is the sort of changes that a firm engages in competing in a marketplace every day. It's looking to improve the performance of its products and services, the efficiency of its production process and its marketing efforts. So effectively what it's doing is enhancing the competencies it already has. Now, a good example of incremental innovation is Intel and the way in which it progressively improved the performance of its processors, moving from the 286 to the 386 to the 486 to the Pentium. Incremental changes in the components that make those chips up, its architecture and its production process to print smaller and smaller detail onto its chips. Now, where the change in components and the change in architecture is radical, we're talking about a step change in the way in which the needs of customers are served or a product is created. Henderson and Clark call that radical innovation. The new way of doing things is almost unrecognizable compared with the traditional approach. So here the competencies you have as a business are made irrelevant. They're destroyed and completely new competencies are required. Now, an example here might be slide rule manufacturers like Queffel and Eisner. You've probably never heard of them. Some of you may not even have heard of a slide rule today. But a slide rule was how all students, engineering jobs, and people in scientific roles would make calculations of logarithms and square roots, etc. Effectively, it was a ruler-like device with sliding parts that you set up and it told you the answer. Now, when the pocket calculator came along in the early 1970s and did all those functions for you, it all but wiped out the slide rule industry. Slide rules actually are still required by pilots in case they need a backup. But to all intents and purposes, that industry was wiped out. And because slide rule manufacturers just didn't have the scale and the competencies to move into electronic calculators, they were wiped out. So radical innovation. Now, in both these two cases, recognizing and understanding possible responses to those innovations is pretty obvious. In incremental innovation, that's the day job. When radical innovation comes along and it's very obvious and you respond or you can't. For large companies, typically they'd buy in the capabilities if they decided response was the right option. Now, the third type of innovation is where the component changes are quite radical, but the architectural change is minimal or at least incremental. And this Henderson and Clark called modular innovation. Now, this is where a large part of the current offering or production process is changed. Perhaps a wind-up radio. Most of the radio remains the same, but the whole power supply unit is replaced with something else. Now, typically, large organisations will be able to respond to this change. It potentially does mean some changes in competencies, but you can bring in the expertise and know-how needed to supplement your existing competencies. Now, the fourth type of innovation is potentially the most risky. Now, this is where changes in components are minimal or incremental. What is happening is the architecture, i.e. the dominant design for how something is put together, is radically changing. Example here would be when passenger airline manufacturers switched over from prop engines to jet engines. While that was a component change, it also required a change in the architecture of how the plane was put together to deal with increased stresses and the dynamics of the new design. So some component change, but a radical change in architecture. Now, as change occurs, different organisations in the same industry can interpret those innovations in different ways. If you think about the emerging internet grocery shopping sector in the UK, we see different approaches being taken by different food retailers. So Marks and Spencer's, up until very recently, ignored the move to internet preferring to rely on the quality of their food to attract people into their stores. You could order ahead, perhaps in the lead up to Christmas, if you wanted your turkey from Marks and Spencer's. You could order that ahead of time, but then you'd go in and then pick up your food from the store. So Marks and Spencer's, in terms of their business model, seeing internet shopping as being an incremental change in component and an incremental change in architecture. Supermarkets such as Tesco's and Sainsbury's take a different view of how internet shopping is going to change their businesses. They see that change as being a radical change in components, although the architecture is only incrementally being impacted. So with Tesco's, you can go online and order your shopping, and then it is delivered to you via a Tesco's van. The order is being fulfilled by adding on that module to their existing business model. A picker will go around the local Tesco store and place your order into the van, which then delivers it to you. Others, though, are seeing the change as more of a change in architecture. The company Ocado is seeing this as being a different approach to fulfillment. So rather than grafting it onto an existing store operation, they have set up separate warehouses for automatic picking of products and loading onto a van, which then delivers to your home. So seeing this more as an architectural change with some degree of incremental component change. You can differentiate the Tesco's and Sainsbury's approach from the Ocado approach by saying that Tesco's, Sainsbury's and possibly Marks and Spencer's are following a bricks and clicks approach. The infrastructure of the supermarket is still a dominant part of their fulfillment process, while for Ocado you can see there as being a clicks only view of the future, where the supermarket becomes unnecessary. In this industry, we're not really seeing an innovation that would count as a radical shift in architecture and a radical change in components. Perhaps in the future we will see Star Trek replicators, 3D printers of food that you have in your home, and so do away with the need for supermarkets and food delivery entirely. But you can see here that the interpretation of how the future is going to play out and what the nature of the change is will result in different responses by different players in an industry. It also means that there is the potential for players to misidentify the nature of the change that is occurring. Now, as I've said, typically component changes and radical innovation is usually pretty obvious to industry players. The biggest risk is where the change is architectural. Often those changes will be interpreted as being component changes by mistake. Now, remember I talked about an example of architectural innovation around when jet engines were coming in to the manufacture of airliners. Well, at that time there were two major US airline manufacturers. There was Boeing, that we all know well today, and there was McDonnell Douglas. Both have been successful in selling their airplanes to major airline companies. Now, when the move happened to jet airlines, both adopted the new technology. Boeing saw this change as having significant implications for the architecture of its products and looked to redesign completely their airplanes. McDonnell Douglas, in contrast, saw this change as being more at a component level. a case of replacing prop engines with their jet equivalent, and so did not go through that same overhaul of the design of their planes. And as a result, Boeing aircrafts became the choice of airline companies, to the extent that ultimately McDonnell Douglas was taken over by Boeing. So misidentifying the type of innovation can lead to failure, and this particularly happens when the innovation turns out to be architectural, and that's because of the dominant design. Now remember, that architecture emerges over time and becomes taken for granted within the firm and the industry, to the extent that it's often not questioned. And hence, when you see an architectural innovation coming along, managers in a firm may not recognize what's happening. And indeed, they can interpret the signals as being more signs of component change. The existing frameworks, the existing analysis processes, mindsets, and approaches lead them to see it as an example of modular change. Now, eventually, the firms wake up to the nature of that change. But then there is confusion about what new architectural knowledge is needed. Now, this is not radical innovation, so not everything needs to change. Not all the knowledge you have needs to be thrown out, but understanding which parts of know-how are valuable and which aren't is difficult. There is then a further barrier. Firm's existing business is based on the old architecture, and that is the source of the majority of the firm's current income and profits. And as a result, the firm is reluctant to divert time and resources to the new architecture, particularly as they don't really understand what is required. And then when it's recognised the urgency with which the firm needs to respond, often the firm is then hindered by the legacies in the business, by its culture, its values, by its legacy IT systems, which delays and hampers its ability to respond. All those barriers to change add up, and for some organisations mean they're unable to change. To give you an example, Firestone Tire and Rubber Company. Now, this is a famous tire company that was founded in 1900 in Ohio in the US. And by the 1970s, it had enjoyed 7 successful decades. It was ranked 40 in the Fortune 500 in the US, so a top 50 company in the USA. It was a large, successful organisation. In 1970, it had 109,000 employees worldwide, the turnover of 2.3 billion and assets worth 2 billion. What's more, it had great relationships with the big 3 US auto manufacturers, Ford, General Motors and Chrysler. Many of the executives in those firms were close friends and even had family connections to Firestone. And this wasn't a moribund company. It was praised for its approach to strategy, its family values and the way it treated its people, and for its capital budgeting process. But in 1970, Michelin launched radial tyres in the USA. Now, this is not a new technology. Michelin had been developing these in the late 1940s, and through the 1950s and 60s they had been quickly adopted in Europe and Asia. And indeed, Firestone's European subsidiaries had witnessed firsthand that growth. And so when Michelin launched these tyres in the US, Firestone responded quickly. But by 1979, Firestone was in deep trouble. Its plants were only running at 59% capacity. It was engaged in costly product recalls due to problems with quality of its radial tyres, and it saw US sales plateauing. This is after decades of high growth, and it was unable to recover from that period. By 1988, it had suffered through 2 hostile takeovers before it was acquired by Bridgestone, the Japanese tyre manufacturer. So here we have a case where a firm has failed as a result of a change in the industry. But clearly it was not the magnitude of the technical innovation involved in radial tyres. Neither was it surprise. Firestone's European subsidiaries had been competing against Michelin in Europe for decades. In terms of Henderson and Clark's types of innovation and change, it's clearly not a radical innovation. Firestone was also held up as an example of a well-run company. It did not lack the resources or expertise to respond. So why did it fail to effectively embrace the shift to radial tyres in the US? Well, there are a lot of signs that Firestone saw radial tyres purely as a component, probably a modular innovation, and did not recognise its impact on the industry architecture. Not recognising it needed different thinking about the production process, quality and manufacturing, and assumptions about market demand. Radial tyres last twice as long as previous types, and so demand for replacements is much lower. Now, looking at the typical behaviours of firms that make this error in recognising architectural change, we see Firestone ticking a lot of the boxes. It treated the introduction of radials like any other promising new investment proposal in its capital budgeting process, and as a result quickly invested $400 million in radial production. That's over 2 billion in today's dollars. But while doing that, it clung to its successful standard production processes, only making minor changes to accommodate radial manufacturing. After all, it was not going to throw away its decades of proven know-how and expertise in tyre production. And at the same time, it continued to seek to grow production of conventional tyres with continued expectation of a return to high growth. Even when sales of traditional tyres were slumping, it invested $200 million, it ramped up its marketing efforts, and it delayed closing the non-radial plants. The chief executive kept emphasizing to the board that its legacy family values, its close customer relationships, and employee loyalty would see it through a difficult time. So seemingly a clear case where the cognitive limits of the organisation failed to recognise an architectural change prompted by a technological development, in this case with disastrous consequences for Firestone. So that's an explanation of this first reason why firms fail to cope with innovation and change. It's down to their cognitive limits and the difficulty of recognising the nature of change and then realigning the organisation to those competencies. In the next video, we'll look at the second reason why organisations fail to respond to new innovations when we look at disruptive innovation. So I'll see you in the next video.